Hello listeners and welcome to this week's episode of The Cult Vault. Before we get started, hello and welcome and thank you so much to my newest patron, John. I am so grateful to have you here and for the activism work that you do. You're supporting the show and enabling me to continue this work on a weekly basis, which is so important. I hope you enjoyed the backlog of exclusive content and the perks of being part of this group. I also wanted to take a minute to discuss the upcoming event, CrimeCon UK. Taking place in London on the 11th and 12th of June, I can finally share with you all the details of my amazing guest, who I will be interviewing live at the event itself. My collaboration is going to be with Elgin Strait. Elgin is the host of Falling Out with Elgin Strait, a podcast focused on the experiences of second-generation survivors of the Unification Church, a cult commonly referred to as the Moonies. Born into the Moonies himself, Elgin's work on the podcast aims to expose the abuse, manipulation and hypocrisy of the institution, as well as to provide a forum for ex-second-generation members to share resources that can aid them in their own journeys out of the cult and through the transition into living in the outside world. Listening to Falling Out has been a catalyst for multiple departures from the cult. I am so incredibly excited and honoured to be able to work with Elgin at the UK's biggest true crime event. Tickets for this are available now, and if you are listening from outside of England, there are even travel and transport packages available from the CrimeCon team. For more about Elgin, please visit his website fallingoutpod.com, and for more about CrimeCon, you can visit crimecon.co.uk, where you'll be able to see the lineup and a schedule for the event that includes guest speakers, detectives, private investigators, there will be police dogs, there will be crime scene investigating experiences available, there will be podcast row, and there will be roundtable discussions, there are parties, there are dinners. It's going to be an amazing event. There are a variety of tickets available, including tickets for NHS workers, students, VIPs and guests. Use the code CULT at the checkout to get 10% off ticket prices, or I even have 15% and 30% off codes for special listeners. There are payment plan options, and so much more is being announced weekly on the website as the event draws closer. But that's enough of business for today. We are going to be revisiting the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints for this instalment. And we have a very personal story of how one person's break from the restrictive and abusive Mormon upbringing had devastating consequences. Through lack of guidance and safeguarding, Megan has experienced very difficult times. But here to talk about her life and road to recovery, she brings hope to every listener. This episode does come with trigger warnings of child sexual abuse, so please proceed with caution. But for now, here is Megan. So hello, Megan, and welcome to the show. Thank you so much for agreeing to come here and add your perspective and experiences on the topic of Mormonism. Would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
Hi, my name is Megan Poets. I currently live in Southwest Mississippi in a town named Natchez, which is super deep south. We're in the crook of the boot of Louisiana, so I'm about 80-ish miles from Baton Rouge, about 3 hours from New Orleans. And I'm originally from the Pacific Northwest, which is the Oregon-Washington border. And I've spent some time in Utah, Colorado, and Pennsylvania and Florida. I'm a huge animal lover, big outdoorsy person, love cosplay, really, really geeky, and was raised in a very strict LDS home.
My favorite part of that introduction is definitely the comment about cosplay, and I really want to know more. Do you like make pieces, or do you have like a specific area that you're most interested in, like video game cosplay or anime cosplay?
So when we started doing family cosplay, we went with Doctor Who. So Doctor Who was very, very popular. We did, I want to say 5 years in a row, 4 or 5 years in a row of my husband cosplaying different doctors. And my child did the TARDIS, and I was the Weeping Angel. And I scared the piss out of everyone with the Weeping Angel.
I love that so much. Family cosplay, it sounds like the best pastime of all pastimes. I I don't know if I've ever seen a family doing cosplay. I did go to a Comic-Con in London one year, which is the biggest one that we have over here. And they have a huge cosplay competition, and some of the pieces that had been created were so detailed and incredible. And my favorite pieces were the ones where people had combined two themes together. So there were I don't know if you're familiar with the video game Fallout.
Yes.
But there were some Fallout Metal Armor-esque pieces, and the people inside them, they looked so small, their heads looked so tiny, and they were like 10 feet above me. But they were done in the style of Harley Quinn. So they were painted with the red and the black and the diamonds and I was just like, wow, this is incredible, because at the time the first Suicide Squad film had just come out, so everybody was all about Suicide Squad, and that was, I just remember looking up at this thing like, wow, how are you even walking around with that, because it was making like woo noises as it was walking and everything. It was so cool.
The best part about those are you put in individual personalized AC units. Otherwise, you are just sweating and just miserable. It's hard enough to walk around a Comic-Con, especially if you're in an intricate outfit like that and you're stopping and photo opping, and they're absolutely so talented. It's amazing to see other cosplayers in action. And
absolutely. And I hadn't even thought about family cosplay. That sounds great. And from everything else that you said, it seems that you've visited most parts of America. Do you have a favorite area?
The Deep South. It took me 10 years from I got it in my head and I was like, that's it. I want to live in the South. And my husband had never left Pennsylvania, as in he's traveled, but he had never been to the West Coast until we started dating. And I took him out to do like the Goonies tour and stuff like that I grew up living in the midst of. And then he worked for GameStop for
awesome,
right around 20 years. So he obviously was doing, their conferences that they go all over, they would do in different cities. So as far as like how much I've traveled, I think I've traveled a little bit more than he has across the US, but he's done more international travel than I've been able to do. But I got it in my head and I was like, that's it. And I started looking for properties, and it took us right around 10 years to get here.
And here you are talking to us from the boot of Tennessee?
The boot of Louisiana. So if you look at the state of Louisiana, it kind of wraps around Mississippi like this, and we're like right around this area of it.
Wow. And near New Orleans as well. So all of these areas are supposed to be areas of like heightened activity with things like ghosts and spirits.
Yes. And that's exactly.
And werewolves.
Mm-hmm. So a little bit of backstory on my husband's family. He is a direct descendant of Lizzie Borden. His middle name is Borden. And I was on the first U.S. Axe League throwing axes that was started in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, where we moved from. So not only do both sides of our lineage have these crazy backstories, but I'm very much in tune with the paranormal, with, that's just, especially growing up Mormon, where you were just not supposed to question anything and not supposed to believe in witchery, sorcery. And of course, I'm the child that's just like, oh my goodness, I
love this. That's wow, that's wild. Has he ever been to visit the house?
So that is on the docket. A couple of years ago, we lost his mom very quickly. And before she fell ill, she all of a sudden had a fire under her to go back and like see the plantation homes and to visit where her family was from. There was, there's a lot of things that she had on her bucket list that all of a sudden she wanted to do the New York tourist stuff again, which she grew up in Long Island. And so all of a sudden when she was doing these bucket list things, and I was just like, damn it, I'm not stopping myself. Look at, like, here's this lady, like, making sure she does these things that she wants to do. And I'm just like, yeah, there's a reason I've been drawn to this family. So for me, the spookier, the better, the more taboo, of course, it draws my interest. And I started studying Buddhism when I was like 12 or 13, well after I had become like an outcast in the LDS community. And, you know, of course, from Buddhism, you start reading into a lot more of what's going on in the US and what a lot of this land was built on. And a large portion of my family is also native. So all of a sudden, the trickle down effect of growing up in this very, very sheltered conservative life was just like, psh, I have to know what's really out there and I have to know what's really going on. And I needed a new perception of, why do we have all these ghost stories?
Especially after what we've just talked about before we hit the record button around race and ethnicity and how certain communities might be perceived within the Mormon church, which I'm sure we'll talk about as we go on. But for people who didn't tune into the previous coverage on this podcast around Mormonism, are there many different sects or branches of this particular faith?
Yes. There's probably three very well known. You have the FDLS, which is the fundamentalists, which might be known throughout Waco, Texas, and some of the stuff that's happened there previously. They're more kind of like almost Amish-like with their lifestyle. They're very segregated from news, from media, from the outside world. They still believe in the compound communal living and polygamy. And then you have this whole thing going on right now with the Mormon community where it's taboo to be Mormon, it's taboo to be LDS. So when I was growing up, it was, you were LDS, Latter-day Saints. And then they've kind of revamped through the years to try to improve their image with changing what they want to be called. So I grew up just being Mormon or LDS. And then you have the FDLS and then the FLSD. So there's absolutely different sects of Mormonism.
That's confusing, isn't it? Having the FLDS and then having the FLSD.
FELSD.
Because they're probably two very similar, but also very different movements in their practices and beliefs. So for one to be mistaken for the other is probably quite an insult.
Yes, very much so. And it's very confusing for growing up in these different sects, because I was taught through the actual church itself that the polygamy wasn't polygamy. That's not what really happened. We don't believe that, so we don't teach that, so we don't discuss it. If you're discussing polygamy, we need to have a discussion in the bishop's office. And then you get a little bit older and a little bit wiser, and then we have, more knowledge of the world just with age and technology, and you find out that there's still polygamy and there's still compounds, and the offshoots for like especially the FDLS, they had to live in hiding. And that is something that we did as well. We weren't like, our family didn't hide from society, but we weren't allowed to openly, like, at school, when my friends would be like, hey, you want to go down to the community church and like do this thing? I wasn't allowed to announce that I was LDS because it was so taboo to my parents to let other people in this tiny village that we grew up in know, because they were afraid for our safety. And then my friends at school would be like, oh, I'm praying for you. And I'm like, why are you praying for me? I'm fine. And they're like, honey, no, you're not. Like,
it's so interesting, those conflicting things, because you're probably, from your perspective, you're like, I'm the one that's okay, it's you that's not okay. And they're probably thinking like, oh, we really need to help this person because she's not okay, because we're the only ones that are okay. So isn't
Yes.
that interesting?
Yes.
Even children have that mentality and that kind of thought around their peer group, which is really quite sad to think about, actually.
Yeah, I mean, how are you going to tell a child, like, here, go to kindergarten and start making friends and start learning how to socialize and develop as a human, but don't tell them who you are, where you are, what you're doing. Don't discuss our religion. You cannot go to another church. That other church is fake. Everybody else's religion is wrong, but we don't discuss it. And it's very, very confusing. And at a very early age, it clicked with me. It's like, well, you're telling me this is the one true church, but there's millions of churches and
Mm-hmm.
millions of religions. And these kids at school are fine. They're good humans. And it was, don't trust them. The devil dresses in wolf's clothing.
That is such a huge responsibility to put on the shoulders of such young people who I believe should be carefree and shouldn't have to carry the burden of those responsibilities until they're older.
Yeah.
And now I'm kind of in the throes of parenthood and trying to make sure that, you know, I'm financially sustained as well as taking care of my well-being and trying to, you know, make sure that I maintain positive mental health, because those things are all important for making sure that I can take proper care of the young ones, and that's without actually taking care of the young ones. So the responsibility of all of those things, I didn't have that when I was growing up. I didn't have to experience levels of such responsibility at such a young age, and I don't think that children should have to. But the education question, I think, is something we will definitely get into soon. So we've broken down some of the different sects and branches that you might find in the Mormon Church. One of them is the FLDS, the Fundamentalist Latter-day Saints. The scandals and the reports of historical child abuse and polygamy, and sex trafficking and all of the horrible things that have come from that church kind of makes me understand why your parents might worry about how you as a child might be associated with the FLDS, even if the LDS church is separate to that, because
Yes.
it's still part of the Mormon umbrella.
Mm-hmm.
And even though the LDS church says that it doesn't practice polygamy in the same way that Warren Jeffs, leader of the FLDS, or was until he was imprisoned, doesn't practice in the way that particular branch does. But I'm sure that a lot of Catholic congregations are tarred with the same brush because of the historic abuse from Catholic priests that has been coming into the public eye over the last decade or two, perhaps more so than it has done in the years before the internet, and things like the Me Too movement and other movements that support and encourage people coming forward to actually testify about abuse that they have experienced. But you grew up in the Latter-day Saints branch of Mormonism, but you just called yourself Mormons. And was this something you were born into, or did your parents join after they had you? What does your journey of early life in the LDS church look like?
So my dad was raised full-time Mormon. And what that means is his mom was born into a Mormon family and is actually one of the original US founding families of Mormonism.
Wow.
His dad was not Mormon and was never Mormon, but to make his wife happy, would go to church every single Sunday. Every Sunday. Not the full service, because service is a minimum of 3 hours. So he would go for what we call sacrament, which is when the entire congregation would meet and the bishop would speak, and we'd have you'd sing and you'd take the sacrament, and they'd teach different lessons or different story ideals of how you should act as a Mormon. My mom was born and raised into a Gypsy Catholic family. So she is first generation US born. Her parents were 110% against her and her older sister converting into Mormonism.
Right.
And the story that I've heard from my mom's side of the family all matches. So I have the desire to believe this. And that was, my grandparents were functioning alcoholics, and my mom and her sister needed to feel loved. So they started branching out away from the Catholic system and found friends that were Mormons, and that invited them to come to different activities. And that's very typical, is let me show you how accepting we are. Let's go to this function. Let's go to something that doesn't have negativity. Let me show you this bright, shiny toy and tell you how great it is. And my mom and my aunt were like, oh my God, everybody is so nice. Everybody's so welcoming. Everybody is sober. You're not screaming at me and doing this and doing that, and woe is me at home. And my grandparents were just like, absolutely not. I am not supporting this. They are not welcome in my home. You're not bringing a missionary in. You do not have my approval. And that is that. So my aunt's first husband and his family, there's 6 of them, and they are all Native. So they were converted to Mormonism, and explained to my aunt and my mom that, like, it's okay. Like, Jesus will love you. You just have to come to these classes, and you just have to learn to accept yourself. So my mom and my aunt converted, and my aunt ended up marrying her first husband very early. My mom was dating her would-be brother-in-law at that time, but they were fairly young. And it didn't work out. So she had met my dad at a youth dance, Mormons, and they started dating. I want to say my mom was like barely 14, barely like 14, 15-ish when she converted, and started dating my dad within a year or so. And there's a 4-year age gap. And in Mormon culture, it's really appropriate for this. You know, you want to wife up around 15, 16. You're not allowed to date until you're 16. So you find your prospective partner before they're scooped up. I mean, it's all but giving the goat to the parents, literally. Like, and you're not supposed to casually date. It's very fundamentalist, where you date with a purpose. Thankfully, my grandparents really accepted my dad. And I think a big part of the acceptance of my dad was that his dad was not Mormon. So they had something they could bond over, which is Mormonism is a crock of shit. So they felt comfortable with it, and they liked my dad. My dad's very personable and very friendly. And my parents have opposite political values. So it's very like, you're taking a boulder and a lily pad and throwing them together, and they found something about each other that they love, with complete opposite backgrounds and lifestyles. My dad's an only child with a very comfortable lifestyle, where my mom was one of 4. And, we had family members that my grandparents were taking care of that didn't speak English. And that, I remember my grandma Bammy, until she passed away, used a toilet seat on top of a bucket to go to the bathroom. She didn't like indoor plumbing because that's just not the Gypsy way before they came over to Ellis Island. And one of my great aunts that passed away right before Christmas would tell us stories all the time of how, like, we just don't know how spoiled we are. And like, so it's just vastly different backgrounds, when my dad has lineage that starts with Joseph Smith grifting in New York State and ending up in Oregon. And it's just absolutely insane how it all played out and pulled together.
your dad's mum, who had grown up within the Mormon faith and had that lineage, as you mentioned, that had such strong ties to the Mormon faith and probably spoke for itself. And then you've got your father's father, who was not kind of linked to the Mormon faith and just kind of went along to services, probably to stop your paternal grandmother from getting such a hard time, because I imagine her position within the church, or that family's position within the church, it would have been extremely frowned upon if she would have decided to build a family with somebody who didn't want to attend Sunday services or didn't want to embrace the Mormon faith. I imagine somebody in her position, that would have been quite a difficult thing to try and get her family to accept. But your kind of, your father's position, kind of, he's got both ends of the spectrum. So no matter what your mother's parent, your mum's parents' views, so your maternal grandparents, he could have pulled from either or, you know. If your maternal grandparents were really into the Mormon faith, he would have been able to say, perfect, well, hey, let me tell you about. But then, it sounds like they were, you know, really kind of destined for each other. And it's nice to hear of parents that meet each other in high demand religious groups and genuinely really fall for each other and have a connection, and just enjoy each other's company, and do truly love one another. Because a lot of the times in these high demand religion groups, especially in groups like the Unification Church, people are just paired together and they never really have that connection. They never have anything in common. They don't share the same interests or hobbies. And the basis of the relationship is just the faith that they both,
just to get married and somebody in your religion and save face and have this pretty picture.
And the story that I was told about the Mormon church when I was growing up in school, many years ago now, was about the Mormon church and Joseph Smith's, well, I suppose for anyone that hasn't listened to the other episodes, we have said Joseph Smith a couple of times, and he was sort of the founder of the Mormon faith. We might talk a little bit about him in this episode, but we might not as well. We spoke about Joseph Smith a lot in the other episode that we've done about the Mormon church, but maybe we will. But Joseph Smith, his views were seen as so radical and so extreme and so fringe in the era that he was proselytizing in the 1800s. I believe we were looking at those dates before we hit the record button. That he ended up taking his followers to a place in America that wasn't even supposed to really be inhabitable, and yet now it's like a whole place, and that's where the majority of Mormons can be found, is in that part of America around Utah and Salt Lake City.
Yeah, so Joseph Smith started out in New York, so upstate New York, and he was ran out. So he then migrated to Illinois, which is southwest of New York. Illinois was just like, no, get out, go. We don't want you here. So they then migrated to Utah and renamed everything in Utah and claimed it. And they bounced around. Arizona and Utah are high demographics of Mormons. And originally, Utah was inhabitable because of it's just full of salt flats, and it stinks, and it's desolate, and it's high desert, and you can't really grow proper crops. You still to this day, they don't have a solid industry that keeps their state high functioning outside of Mormonism. And like we spoke about before we started recording, that is where MLMs and pyramid schemes came. Joseph Smith is the king of the grifters. He figured out how to grift all the way to Utah. And then once he was there, he had to find a way to get money. And one of the biggest things you are taught as a Mormon is money is nothing. You acceptance is found in other areas. You need to, be kind, be humble, work hard, keep everything within the families, take care of families first, take care of the community of Mormons. But then they also pay 10% tithing. So every dollar they earn, they pay 10% to the church. Why?
I think it was in the recent Amazon docuseries LuLaRich, where the two co-founders were very, very devout in their Mormon faith.
And they still are to an extent.
And is it this multi-level marketing company that springs to mind for most people when they think about MLMs in the Mormon Church, or are there any other notable MLMs to mention?
Mary Kay, Avon, wow. Monet is one that right now is very well known, but they're not linked to Mormonism. I want to say that is one of the huge ones, at least here, that has just branched off to Australia that is not directly related to any fundamentalists at all. And that's because the owner and CEO is from Argentina or Brazil.
It's interesting about what's interesting about Joseph Smith taking his followers to somewhere desolate that seems almost inhabitable is that reminds me so much of so many other leaders of different groups throughout history. And I'm not sure if you could put Joseph Smith in the same bracket as these people I'm about to mention, but there are probably very strong arguments that you absolutely could. So Jim Jones took all of his followers over to Guyana, and Rock Terrier of the Anthill Kids took all of his followers over into a very isolated and desolate woodland area in Canada. And Charles Manson took all of his followers over out into Death Valley. So what seems to happen in these very high demand groups is that they are driven out of the areas they live in, either through the leaders' sheer extreme levels of paranoia, or, and wanted to remain as away from the public eye as possible, as undetected as possible, depending on what level of crimes they are committing, what types of crimes they're committing, or what types of activities they are getting into that they don't want people to oversee that aren't involved in the group. But also most of the time, just because they're not widely accepted by the public. And so they are driven out of areas and go to these remote, desolate areas that seem almost uninhabitable. And then it's the followers who start to cut the trees down and build the cabins and put irrigation in. And so all of these amenities that didn't exist before suddenly exist. And now people just live in Salt Lake City. People just live there. It's like it's always been a place that people have lived in.
Well, it has been, but it was stolen. I think to a certain documented history, Utah's very, very habitable by the Native Americans. They were doing fine. And then somebody came in and said, hold on, I'm going to throw a wrench into this. And at that point in history with the US, the Native Americans valued their family more than they valued fighting for land that wasn't serving a good enough purpose for them. So it was not easy, but it was reasonable to say, okay, fine, you want to live in this nasty salt flat that smells like sulfur and doesn't grow any crops? Have it. Take it. I'm going to go back where it's a little bit warmer down south and go back to Arizona and New Mexico and Mexico. Take it. Take it. You want this area? Ugh, nobody else wants it yet, so have at it.
I think I actually remember as well learning about how the the followers of Joseph Smith tried to adopt a lot of the methods that Native Americans were using around making sure that the entirety of the buffalo was utilized, whether that was using the pats for fuel for the fires, or making sure that, you know, the skin was used for insulating clothing and things like that. But they couldn't make it work in the way that the Native Americans did. And I remember just reading about there being a lot of struggle and starvation. And just, as you said, you know, they couldn't grow any crops. So they kept planting things in the soil, or not even being able to dig into the ground because it was so arid.
Really hard earth. Yeah.
So if Salt Lake City and Utah and those areas of America are the most densely populated Mormon areas of America, but you mentioned quite a lot of your family being involved in Mormonism, where were you at this point in your life to be surrounded by so many people that identified with the Mormon faith, but not being in Utah?
So my dad's mom is from Utah.
Okay.
So when they resettled from the East Coast, they were welcomed and established in southern Utah, in St. George. So really, really southern Utah, where it's actually pretty. I hate to say it, it's pretty. It has some foliage and some greenery. It still can't take on a lot of crops. And I don't recall very well right at the moment at what happened, but I do know that my grandmother's mother passed shortly after giving birth to the last of, I think there is 9 of the 9 siblings. So that left dad providing and the oldest children taking care of the youngest children, which is a very Mormon thing to do, is the oldest are taking care of the littles. And especially when you have this ideology that tells you that the more children you have, the better, because then you're growing your own compound in your own community, and there's power in numbers. It's cringy. Very, very cringy.
I've written here lots of kids question mark on my question list. So that would have been a question at some point to ask you, if it is very normal for families to be so large in the Mormon faith.
Yes, we used to get made fun of. My parents only have 3 biological children, and then we were the primary caretakers for my 2 younger cousins that are more like brothers. So we were not as high standing in a lot of the members' eyes because we had such a small family. Like, what's wrong with us? Why didn't your parents have more? Are you really Mormon? There's only 3 of you. This is something I heard all the time. And it was meant to be a little bit of a joke, but also within the Mormon culture and community, it was like, well, what's wrong with you? Nothing's wrong with us.
I know that quiverful is a denomination of the Christian church, but is that an expression that might be used in the Mormon church? Have a quiverful family, sort of like a large number of children?
I think outside of the culture, it could be very well used and associated, but inside the church and inside the members' heads and the brainwashing and the ingraining that you have from birth, it is just, God won't give you anything you can't handle.
And what about women that can't bear children?
Then there's something wrong with them.
Oh, gosh. Okay. So
they're sinners. They did something outside of marriage. They made choices that left them barren. And especially if you're a single woman who, God forbid, wanted to adopt a child because you weren't married, it was just absolutely unheard of. Almost more taboo than becoming a single parent. We would whisper about, I clearly remember to this day, her name is Kathy Bates. Because of my sci-fi love, I always will remember this. She
Yeah,
was
for a
single.
second there, I was thinking, surely
And
not.
in the Mormon church, you refer to everyone as sister, brother, and then their name. So it was Sister Bates. We would whisper from the pews in the middle of church, like, Sister Bates is still single. Sister Bates is still single.
Oh,
This poor woman was sweet as pie. And she actually had to go to the bishop and get fucking permission to adopt a child out of foster care. And I was just so mad, so mad, not only at myself for judging her because of how we were taught to behave and to think about a family, but because this woman was single, there had to be something wrong with her. And then, oh, she wants to be single and adopt a child out of foster care. What in the world is she thinking? Where is her value? Even my own mom was just like, well, not everybody has that partner. Being little, we call it Molly Mormon. You're a good Mormon girl. You follow all the rules, and God just didn't think that she had enough value to be a spouse, to be a wife. Heaven forbid. Who knows? Maybe she was gay. Maybe she just had an experience that made her not comfortable dating, or who knows what the real
yeah,
situation
it could
was. It
be
was
anything.
just,
Could be like she met somebody outside of the church that she really connected with, but was so worried to be with somebody that didn't want to assign themselves to the Mormon faith that she didn't pursue that relationship. Could be that
yeah.
she is asexual and never met anybody else that was asexual and happy to be in a relationship where there isn't that sexual element. There can still be a level of intimacy and relationship between people that are asexual, but there doesn't have to be that element of actually taking part in sexual activities. And perhaps if she felt that way, or if that's how she identified and never met anybody else that she thought she could be in a relationship with and not be pressured into sexual intercourse or
Right.
sexual acts, that she just decided to stay on her own. Nice if you find somebody that you connect with on that level, that that you would consider a life partner and somebody you want to build a family with. But that's not everybody has to do that. You can still have a family without having that significant other. So yeah, I can see why as a child you might be encouraged to whisper amongst yourselves, probably much like the adults were. You were probably much just mimicking the behaviors that you were
100%.
witnessing.
Yeah.
So I don't think that is necessarily something that you should feel too guilty for, but the fact that you are able to step away from that now and realize that
how awful that is. Yeah.
And I so there was three of you all together.
So there's three biological cousins. And then my two little cousins. My aunt's 16 years younger than my mom, so she's close to my age.
Okay.
We're still very close. My aunt and uncle are significantly younger than my mom and her sister that converted to Mormonism. And they're so much like me. And that bothers my mom. So from a very early age, it was very well known that I was the black sheep based upon I look like that side of the family. I act like that side of the family. I'm more in tune with them. I ran to them. I still do to this day. I run to my aunt before I run to my mom.
Your mom's like, I grew up with her my whole life and now I'm going through it again with my own child.
Yeah.
So really there was 5 of you.
Mm-hmm.
What did education look like for the 5 of you growing up?
So thankfully, my parents were huge proponents of education. So my mom graduated high school in June. turned 18 in September, and was married in November. That being said, my dad is 4 years older, and something that was very important for both of them is education. They actually supported each other, working all day and going to school at night. And
Wow.
I remember very clearly at a very young age, I think I was like 5 or 6 when one of them went back to night school, and it was a well-oiled machine. We got up, we had to go to school, we had our chores, we had to take care of the barn animals and the farm. And you went to school and your job was to get an education. And they ingrained that in us with continuing their own education. So I can say for our family, and my aunt that's Mormon was not like this. Education was not a priority for her household. My parents absolutely insisted, no matter what, you will be educated. And it didn't matter what the education was. It was expected. And I can say very thankfully, along with that, for whatever reason, the way my mom cherry picked some of the Mormon culture, it was never pushed on us that we needed to be married and have children at a young age. The education, the independence, the know how to change a tire, how to take care of yourself was a priority.
Yes, Mum.
I will give them that. Thank you for that, because, it's not just messed up enough to grow up in a household that's very split family religions, but so conflicting religion and conflicting family, how they got along, and how the dynamics of watching your grandparents be alcoholics and your parents sort themselves and then bring you back in and then take you away and bring you back in anytime somebody is not currently sober, which was a necessity for many reasons I figured out as I was older. But when I was little, it didn't make sense. And it was alluded to because I wasn't allowed to have very many friends outside of the church when I was younger. One of my good friends was like, well, don't you know why they do that? And no, they don't tell me anything. I'm just a kid. And I had a friend that was like, well, yeah, my dad's an alcoholic too. And I'm like, what's an alcoholic?
Oh,
I didn't know this. Like, I was old enough to understand, and I needed to know that it's okay for adults to do adult things, but my parents wouldn't share that. So when somebody else said, well, my dad's an alcoholic too, that's why he can't pass the sacrament. I'm like, what is that? And they're like, you don't know what beer is? And I'm like, no, root beer, literally root beer. We're not allowed to have that, but it has caffeine in it. And my friend is just like, no, Megan,
that speaks so much to the resilience of young people and how often they are forced to grow up before their years due to traumatic circumstances and difficult home lives that they experience. And I've seen that a lot in previous lines of work that I've had, where I've worked with vulnerable young children that have grown up in environments that might cause them to become resilient in that way and grow up a lot quicker. But you mentioned that you went to public school, you were able to interact with people outside of the Mormon faith, even if you were encouraged not to do so. So yes. What did your daily and weekly commitments to church activities look like?
So in the home, every Monday night was called Family Home Evening. And after your chores were done, you did dinner. And then my parents we had a subscription to the Mormon magazine, and it's the Ensign. And we would read from the monthly magazine subscription, and we would talk about what the articles in the magazine meant and how to be good Mormons and how to be good Mormons to our, good people to our family home, but also our wards. So each church is called a ward. And it was very much we sang Mormon songs, and we talked about Mormon history, and we talked about the importance of staying pure and purity culture to a very limited extent. It was just, we got CTR rings, which is choose the right. And it was literally a ring with a shield on it. And it said CTR to remind you to choose the right.
that's not for you though, is it? That's for other people who might look at your hands and be like, oh, she's wearing a ring.
It's a label. It is. It's a label. It's a status symbol within the church, but it's a reminder for the outsiders to like, back off. I have my shield. I have my shield. I have my ring on. Leave me alone. And then it was a lot of labor. I don't want to say like child labor, but it was, we didn't have outsiders come in. So we grew up in the country, which also adds to it in a small community. But you didn't have an electrician come in and do work. You didn't have a plumber. You didn't have a mechanic shop that you took the cars to. You did it all yourself because they're outsiders, and outsiders don't like us.
Well, a lot of the times when I reference why it might be difficult for people to leave insular communities that they've been a part of their entire lives, it's because of, I always go to this example I heard from somebody who wanted to leave the Mormon faith, and they owned a roofing company, but the area that they lived in, it was populated by people that identified with the Mormon church. So if he was to leave the Mormon faith, he would no longer have any roofing business, and he would not have a way to support his family because nobody would use his business if he was no longer, in air quotes, a Mormon roofer. So in that kind of same sense, would you say that that's similar? You would only 100%. Use people within your community to come and help you carry out those tasks, or you'd only employ sort of another Mormon company to help you, I don't know, file your taxes or fix your car.
My mom became a CPA because you couldn't trust a non-Mormon CPA. They could not see how much you were contributing back to the church. They couldn't be trusted. I had this belief in me that a non-Mormon CPA was, and this is my parents doing, they're bad, they're evil. They drink to get through their drudges of their day because they don't have Jesus. Not only, yes, you only used other Mormon companies, but the area I grew up in, there was 5 other families that were Mormon. So you didn't go outside of that. One of them was a restaurant owner, and they were what we called Jack Mormons because their restaurant served alcohol.
Oh, okay.
And they did this because it brings in lots of money. Another family they ran a nursery. So they did like trees and shrubberies and berry bushes and stuff like that. And they gained a lot of popularity with our community because they also hired immigrants. And they were one of the few businesses in that area at the time that would allow people to come up from Mexico and Guatemala and help them get their immigration status and give them work that with livable wages. But it was not no strings attached. They were literally going to these communities as missionaries and then saying, we're such a good church and have so much faith in you. And we know you'll be so happy with our church. Look, we'll bring you to the US and we'll give you a job and we'll give you housing.
Kind of get into potential labor trafficking and human trafficking territory.
Yes. Yeah, it's really sick and scary. And even talking about it now, I'm like, God, that's disgusting. Like,
positioned to be doing the workers or the individuals who come to work. It's the way that it's positioned, that it's those people that they are doing the favor for, as opposed to them getting the extremely cheap, probably not within employment regulations work, fit 14 to 16-hour days. I'm just speculating here because I don't really know. But from the trends that we've seen, it's likely that is a possibility, to come and kind of pick fruits and turn over ground and things like that.
And why wouldn't you, if you were in a position where you could go for a better life and be there legally? Why wouldn't you take that opportunity if you're somewhere where like you're just not making ends meet and you're scared and
And
you're looking for acceptance?
there could be a high number of conversions into the Mormon faith as well, if that's the approach that you're using. And of course,
The
what comes with
Hispanic
that?
community is the number one
Wow.
like they
Okay.
prey on Hispanics
And then
and
comes from
Latinos.
every converted person into the faith comes the 10% tithe that you mentioned earlier on.
Yeah, you're just
Wow.
a money
So
train.
it's a tried and tested methodology that's in place. Wow. Okay. Aside from the Monday nights where you would sit down with your family after dinner and go through the propaganda that was supplied to you through the church, were there any other daily or weekly commitments that you were expected to commit to?
Yes, every Wednesday we had youth group and we called it young men's and young women's. And depending on what your age is your status with the church. So when you're really young, that might just mean getting together with your ward and just doing some games, whether it be like a sports activity or a community service, whether it be like a park attached to the church or cleaning the church. So you'd have Monday nights are family, Wednesday nights are youth group, Saturday or Fridays they used to do something and I never did it because I was never fully accepting of all of the propaganda. And then Saturdays were always all of your sporting events and typically another service, community service, which was cleaning the temple, cleaning the church. And then Sundays, you were committed a minimum of 3 hours for church service and typically several more hours on Sunday doing other community services, which was always cleaning, cooking, and then outside of that, so Sundays you're committed really like six solid hours to the church day. Wow. And then you weren't allowed to do anything else on Sundays. Nothing. You did not clean your home. We had to take care of the farm, of course, but those families that were lenient on the rules and had TVs weren't allowed to watch TV. You weren't allowed to use the radio. You couldn't call your friends. Depending on how strict your parents were and what your education looked like, you could possibly be doing homework. So for my siblings and I, typically we were doing homework on Sunday because there was nothing else to do.
Wow. So if you're looking at sort of, I mean, I don't know how long you would have looked at the magazine with your family or how long youth group lasted, but if you say typically 2 hours for each evening activity after school, you've got Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, where there are commitments. And if you kind of just say that they last 2 hours, that's
easily 20 hours a week of church.
Well, it's 10 hours just Monday to Saturday. If you're just saying 2 hours, and then Sunday it's the 3 hours mandatory plus however much extra. So if you just kind of throw an extra 2 on that, that's 15 hours kind of just pulling a number out of the air. And that's probably, from what you've said,
and that doesn't include babysitting so the parents can go to the temple and
oh, of course, yeah, because you mentioned earlier on that there is a significant amount of parentification that happens within the Mormon church, which can be quite detrimental, actually, not just because of the effect that the responsibility of looking after their siblings might have on the individual, but also because of the relationship strain between the person looking after the siblings and the siblings who are looking up to that older sibling as their parental figure. It can cause significant strains between
oh yes
siblings.
It was guilt trips after guilt trips of the littles are looking up to you. Look at the example you're setting. You're not being worthy. always, 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 always an underlying dig at why you're not being a good example and what will the neighbors think?
And of course, it almost makes sense that parentification plays such a big part in some high demand religious groups, because if you have a family of 9 children, or if you only have I say in air quotes 5, because I mean I have 2 and I'm overwhelmed, so you only have 5, and it's kind of like semi joked about. If you were to have like 9, 10, 12 children, it's impossible for, I mean, I think anyway, I don't know because I haven't experienced this, but I would imagine that it's impossible for a parent to parent that many children in the way that I just about managed to do for only 2 of mine. So it's almost like parentification has to exist for children to get fed and clothed and to be stimulated and to take part in activities. But it's not fair to say to the older sibling, or to put the responsibility on older siblings to parent the children, so that the parents can not have that responsibility and go out and take part in other activities, or go and take part in their other church-based activities that they are committed to taking part in. Much like you go to youth group on a Wednesday, it might be that some parents are committed to going to singing group or choir, or where they go and bake for next week's fair, where they're going to be raising money for the church, or whatever it might be. I don't personally, and people are free to disagree with me, I don't personally believe that it's fair to put that parental responsibility on children and young adults who themselves need parenting.
Yeah, it's not only is it inappropriate because you're the adult and you chose to have these children, but then you're putting all this pressure on them to be an example to them when you don't even know who you are, and you're not allowed to be an individual, and you have no identity as a young human in the first place. So to then have to hold yourself to this expectation of something that doesn't even exist in the first place, because you're being told that this fictional book is factual, and we weren't taught the Bible. We were taught the Book of Mormon. So it's such a fantasy, and the adults are all just playing into it and just expect you to do as you're told, no matter what they're really doing. And then you have these little kids who are idolizing you, and they're just like, oh, you're so worthy. You didn't hear you're such a good person, or that was really nice, thank you. It was, oh, you're so worthy. Oh, your servant's heart. Oh. And it's like, obviously, once you hit a certain age and then you get those hormones surging with you too, you're like, I don't want to be a servant. I am not your tool.
You know what? And that speaks so much to the experience that I have working with children who are young carers. So young carers are are young people who look after somebody else in their home. So it might be a parent or a sibling that's struggling with a cognitive disability or a physical disability. Some of the children I worked with would take a disabled parent, a bedbound parent, and help them get washed every day, help feed them every day. There were 8, 9-year-olds administering medication.
Wow.
That was actually regulated medication. So it was often psychotic medication that the person that they were caring for would need, that would often have to be signed off by a nurse or doctor to actually be administered. So these young people had a lot of responsibilities, and it wasn't always, that might be in more of a severe case that I'm referring to, but there were a lot of siblings who were in a house with brothers and sisters who were experiencing various forms of autism or ADHD, or had kind of a neurodivergence of some type. And it was falling on the young person that I would work with to stimulate the brother or sister, walk the brother or sister to school, and then walk themselves to school, even though they were like 10, 11 years old. And so a lot of the time when the children were young, we started to work with young carers when they were 6 years of age. And when the 6-year-olds to maybe 11-year-olds would come in, they would say, I absolutely love looking after my mum. I really love looking after my granddad. I just want to look after my sister for the rest of my life. And they were so innocent and so pure and passionate in their caring role that it was so heartbreaking. And then once the children would hit the ages of sort of 12, 13, as you mentioned, when sort of the hormones start to kick in, they would be like, I hate living at home. I don't want to be there anymore. I'm sick and tired of all this responsibility falling onto me. I just want to be able to go out with my family. I just want to be able to go out with my friends. I want to be able to have sleepovers at my house like all the other kids are doing in my year, but I'm embarrassed to bring kids back to my house because my dad's in a wheelchair. And all of these different thoughts and feelings would come out from these young adults, who then start to grow resentful of their caring role and resentment towards the parentification that had been placed on them from such a young age. And you really could see the transition, as you mentioned, between the young children and the teenagers. And I imagine that the parentification that happens within the Mormon faith starts to feel that way for a lot of young adults when they reach that age where they just want to express that individualism. And when you're talking about Kathy Bates or Sister Bates, and you're all hushed voices and gossiping about her and laughing about her, that lack of individualism that you're allowed to explore or develop, and so you mimic possibly your role models even more than the typical child would outside of a high demand religious group. Of course that is going to be the characteristics that you adopt, because you don't know what other type of characteristics you might have, because you haven't been allowed to explore those things. So you are just copying the people that at your tender age you believe are so worthy, in air quotes again.
And if you're a Molly Mormon, then you don't question anything. And the older you get, the more complacent you are with how sheltered you are, because the outside world is portrayed as so scary and dangerous and unaccepting of our ways. So there were so many other teenagers that were like, no, this is just how it is. And with my aunt's family, they stayed in the city. So they stayed in Portland, and they had a lot more exposure to a lot of things. So they were more like worldly, in my opinion. And I got to the point where it's like, well, I want to hang out at my cousin's house. And I would literally beg my parents, just needle them, let me stay at Aunt Lisa or my Aunt Penny's. I want to stay with my cousin Lisa, just please, please, please. Just to get away, just to like watch a movie that wasn't G-rated. Like, I was begging to watch a PG-13 movie.
But the fact that you were trying to go to your cousins and your aunt's house to participate in those activities is probably another reason why your parents might have been a bit reserved in agreeing.
Well, that was the Mormon aunt's house. So that was always my ploy, was like, but what could go wrong? What could go wrong? What could go wrong? They sexually abused all of us. That's what went wrong.
Oh, no.
But my mom's parents lived right there. So my mom's parents started acquiring properties in the neighborhood that my mom was raised in. So they owned around 15 properties in a 2-3 block radius. So it was like this little safe compound of this mix of really messed up Mormons and then a mix of like our family that was more normal. So it was always a dirty ploy just to get over to my grandparents' house when they were drinking, or my parents said they were drinking, or, they weren't right in the head, because I knew if I went over to my grandma's house that one, I was going to be exposed to things that weren't Mormon related, and I wasn't going to have to watch my every word and my every move. And, she taught me how to play cards, and she'd cuss in front of me, and like, normal things, like, and it was just really about being normal at a certain level. But my grandparents also protected me. And I knew this. I knew that, like, my mom's family had me, where my dad's family, they were a little bit more spread out. So we didn't get to see them often because it would take several hours to get over to their house. And when I was younger, the commute just from the village that I grew up in to get into Portland was a minimum of 45 minutes, depending on like if we could get to the highway, because we lived really far out. And if you couldn't cross a bridge, you couldn't get out of the village. So you couldn't get to town. And in specifically the 80s, it was just always a little bit of a challenge to get out of the rural communities to get into town. And then they rebuilt the highway. So that was shut down for like 4 or 5 years. So it was more challenging to get out. So it was more of a draw for me to run to my mom's family, who was, in my little brain at that time, was so much more honest and open with me. So, I figured out at a young age, I think, how to manipulate enough to find some normalcy. And begging to go stay with family members just so I could watch TV, so I could have soda, so I could have pizza, things that I wasn't allowed to do at my parents' house, not to do farm chores all weekend long, anything I could do to get exposure was really, really important to me. And in turn, that reflected poorly on my parents in the church. They were like, and they would say it. My dad, much less than my mom. But it was, what are the people at church going to think if I let you go spend the weekend there? Who cares? Who cares?
It must have been pressuring for your parents, though, I imagine, that their image and how they came across to others, and trying to not be the subject matter of the gossip that happened in various congregations, because as you've said, it was a gossip culture. Your parents were semi-ridiculed for having 3 to 5 children. So even when people appear to be joking in some of the times in these groups, it's almost like passive aggressive joking.
Yes.
Like, that's funny, isn't it? But it's not really funny, and we're all judging you. And everybody has the holier than thou attitude, which is difficult to digest when we hear some of these interviews. But you mentioned there that you were restricted in some ways with your leisure time. You've spoken about how you did have the opportunity to interact with peers in your year group at school that weren't necessarily within the Mormon church. But was there ever the opportunity to spend time with them outside of school? If it wasn't your grandparents' house that you were visiting from a reprieve from some of the restrictions on leisure time within your house, were you accessing anything anywhere else that might be seen as secular or worldly, or were you able to kind of harness your individualism in any way? I feel like you're a little bit of a rebel, so I feel like you may have found ways to do this at some point.
I think until about age 10, I was willing to conform to some extent. I was willing to put up with it because I was still learning. I still doubted. I doubted the religion from a very, very early age. And I was embarrassed at school to have the other children know. And in the beginning, it was because I was taught to hide it because we were judged and the outside world was so scary. And then once I really kind of like opened my eyes enough to understand, and I'm talking like year 3, year 4. So 8, 9, 10-year olds, they start getting a little catty and a little mean. And I'd ask to go to a birthday party and my parents would say no. Or, but so and so is going to be there. And the other Mormon families and we had 2 girls in the same year. And if I would say, like, they're going, their parents are letting them go, then it was like, okay, I'm going to call their parents. And if we could convince all the parents that, like, we'll be good, we'll be really, and that was what it was, is I promise we'll be good. We have each other. Nothing can go wrong.
Yeah.
Then we could start doing a little bit. And, we had been so forced to make these relationships with just those few Mormon families that we really did latch on to those because that was our only freedom and our only chance to get away. By the time I was in year 7, year 8.
So how old
12,
are you
13.
in right, 12, 13. So over here, that would be year 9, 7th to 8th grade. Right. Okay. So once you're kind of 13 years old.
That's when I started running hard.
Yeah. Yeah.
And for the Mormon upbringing, it was disastrous. I was awful in my parents' eyes. I figured out that my friends had access to alcohol, and because I was so sheltered from it, let me tell you, to this day, if I smell peach schnapps, I want to vomit.
Oh, gosh. Oh, no. I think most people have those experiences with at least one type of alcohol where they think if I even think about it, it's going to make me feel like I might be dying. So perhaps the sheltering from your grandparents and their condition made you perhaps more curious around trying alcohol or the subject of alcohol, or would you say that that's not a fair assumption?
It became very glamorous, very, very glamorous. My mom's one and only brother actually grew pot. So I knew we would sneak over on Christmas. We would sneak over to his house because, again, it was a communal city situation.
Right.
And it was just we could cut from my grandparents' backyards to my uncle's backyard, and we would
rob him.
City kids taught me well. We would have lookouts. We would have the littles look out for us, and we would go and we'd peek in the basement and we'd peek in the grow house. And
do you think he knew that you take it from him, and he was 100%, like, let the kids
100%. He just let it happen. He was the best. He really became a second father to me when I was a teenager and could drive, and I would be out at his house as often as I could.
Would you say that this uncle was a devout Mormon or loosely connected to the faith, or not Mormon whatsoever?
So it's on my mom's side where he was not one of the Mormons. It was just my mom and her older sister converted, and then her 2 younger siblings did not. And that side of the family just didn't push religion at all. Okay. It was not, they were born Catholic, and it was just kind of like, whatever, if you want to be religious, then be religious. If you don't, you don't. But my uncle having the pot farm, and one of their cousins, who's the same age as my uncle, he ran in a bad circle. And I remember I must have been 11, I remember 11, 12. all of a sudden my uncle and my cousin CJ ran into my grandparents' house and they were like, help us. And we're just kind of sitting there, just like, what's going on? And my grandparents were like, get in the basement and shut up. And we walk over to the house next door. And my cousin CJ had pissed off an Asian gang and they came after him. And my grandfather was a logger. So we had oak wood doors that were 5-6 inches thick. And they had thrown Chinese stars so far in we couldn't pull them out.
What? No, that is
He
not
had
a true
done the
story.
Asian gang dirty on a Coke deal, and my parents lost it. I wasn't allowed down there for so long after that, so long. But not just because of my uncle and my cousin's choices, but because I was there when it happened. And I remember them hiding in my grandparents' basement for hours and hours and hours, and my grandparents sweating, calling my parents to come get us. And they were trying to be a little bit shady with my parents. And they're like, hey, the kids, it's time for the kids to go home. But don't come to the house. We'll come to you. And my grandparents did not like driving out to where my parents lived because it would take them almost 2 hours to go round trip. And my parents knew the second they said, we'll bring the kids home, that something was up. And they got there and the police were searching the house next door and taking pictures. And my dad's dad was a county sheriff where they grew up in the city. So of course my dad's going to go straight to his dad and be like, what the F is going on?
Your dad's dad was a sheriff and he was the one that kind of just went to services on a Sunday
to appease.
Right.
Yeah.
It's okay for him to wear a badge if he's a part of the Mormon church?
So it was prestige. It was really prestigious for my grandmother to be married to somebody who was in the Navy and then out of the Navy was a sheriff.
Right.
So she married up.
Right. Because in some religions, they don't condone people bearing arms or badges, right, because of the separation of church and state.
Right. But that's for the Mormons in the area at the time, it was very honorable because he was in the military and then came out and was in the police force.
That is such a wild story that you've just told me. And
so what is crazy.
Even more wild is the fact that you felt safer or more alive or more in tune with your grandparents than you did with your own household in the Mormon church, even though the Mormon church is trying to teach you, or outwardly trying to teach you, how to be an upstanding member of the Mormon community, how to be a good person, how to follow certain pieces of rhetoric and doctrine to be a pure person, a godly person, somebody that conforms to Joseph Smith's ideas of what a true faith-based person looks like. But you are like, yeah, I just want to go hang out at my grandparents' house who are having shurikens thrown at their door and police storm in the area.
Yeah. And that wasn't the only experience that was just unhinged for me in my own family. For at that point, I was just I was old enough then to realize that it's okay to be different. Like CJ was fine. He was a total F up. Of course, because you don't have those things happen to you if you're playing the life game safely. But for me to watch two vastly different worlds collide, it made me so much more secure in the fact that my feelings that the Mormon church wasn't proper or honest or even believable.
Yeah.
It kind of gave me hope that like I can still choose my own path. There was no middle ground. Not until I was much older.
Oh my goodness. So you just went full rebellion.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And really quickly, very, very, very quickly, I went from being a preteen to teenager to absolute hell on wheels because I had a vengeance against the family and the church.
And do you think at the time your parents came to pick you up because they knew something was wrong with your grandparents saying, oh no, it's okay, we'll bring her home? Do you think that they were worried more this might be a really...
It was 100% how would other members of the church feel?
Exactly, that was going to be my question.
It wasn't my safety.
That was going to be my question. And I don't like to put people on the spot a lot of the times or ask them to make hard judgments against their loved ones. But my question was going to be, do you think their initial thoughts were, is my daughter safe? Or, oh my goodness, what would other people think?
No, it was never about me. It was never about my siblings being in harm's way. It was absolutely what is the church going to think? What is the bishop going to think? Who cares what the bishop thinks? Like, honestly, it was so exciting just to be like, holy crap, this is what happens. Like, this is life. So instead of me idealizing the church and the worthiness and the holiness, I was all of a sudden just fascinated with living this dangerous side because I had never been shown any form of middle ground in reality, or choices have consequences and the actions that you choose affect more than just yourself. I had only ever been shown you work as a unit and you present yourself as this very meek, mild-mannered female, and that's that. So there was no way for me to understand that everybody was making choices based upon what they felt was good for them without ever considering what might be wise to teach a child. And that's something that I've carried over as a parent myself is, of course, you want to protect your child and your children and your house and your family. But it's very, very important for me to make sure that my teenager understands now that it's okay to have these normal emotions and desires, and it's okay to make normal, crappy choices. But let's at least be informed, because if you have enough information to make a choice, I will hope that in the moment when things go south, you call me and know that I'll be there and not, why did you do that? It's going to be more of like, oof, how drunk are you? Are you going to throw up in my car?
I feel like that's a good approach, but I feel like that is an approach that comes from lived experience. And I wonder what your journey into full-blown rebellion looked like. So is there a way that you can talk us through that? You did mention briefly before, and it's completely up to you whether you would like to talk about this or focus on it, that there were some elements of sexual abuse that were experienced. I don't know if that was a part of your journey into full rebellion, or how you arrived into that phase of your life and what that looked like for you.
So something that is very heavily discouraged from speaking about in the Mormon religion is the abuse and the misuse of power and the misogyny. So my mom's older sister that converted into the Mormon religion with her married very young, and she married into a Native American family. So yeah, there's so many names here. So Earl, my uncle, his father Lloyd actually died in prison, and I had mentioned this to you. He died in prison for sexual abuse of minors. not even the family members, but he was finally imprisoned because he was molesting foster children that his own children were fostering. And it was not a secret in our family. It was only a secret to the children. And he had a very niche age group, and he liked them very young. So I know, looking back after years of therapy, it's very obvious why my parents chose to raise us so remotely. Everything my mother grew up around living in a city was a negative for her. The alcohol use, the family that her sister married into turned out to be a ruse. They sucked them into this religion, and now she's choosing to believe that it wasn't religion based, it was family based. Whatever anyone's personal opinion is, I can only speak on my experience. So my Uncle Earl's father was in the military, and the story is pretty dicey. But when all of us cousins who are comfortable speaking about it today, the best we can remember is Lloyd and his platoon had actually set a village on fire, and it was a farm, and they shouldn't have done it. It wasn't part of the military practice. It wasn't a part of anything they were supposed to be doing. And on this farm were a lot of Indigenous families that were imprisoned. And one of the farmers was able to take several of the youngest children and hide them at a neighboring farm. And after a few years, this disgusting man went back and found the farm and claimed one of the Indigenous women, and that's our grandmother, Lucille. And he took her. He bought her off the farmer. And they were able to falsify documents, and he forced her to marry her. And she was stolen off a Lakota Indigenous tribe land when she was a newborn. And the farmer had multiple Lakota members working at his farm. She was around age 12 or 13 when they got married. And being in the military and stealing an Indigenous child in that time was not abnormal or very well controlled. And the military chose to transfer him. And that's how they ended up on the West Coast. Obviously, a grown-ass man doesn't steal a child unless they're a predator. And her abuse may have even started before she was forced into the marriage. Lloyd subsequently bribed several of our family members to leave the reservation and join the church. So anyway, they had 6 children very quickly, and she was very young and uneducated and barely spoke English because she was raised on a reservation and sent back and forth from a reservation to a farm. And being an Indigenous child, she was terrified. She would never stand up to a white man. And because he was in the military and he was Mormon and he looked like this stupid savior, and he put on a suit every Sunday and presented as this normal human, he got away with it. And she didn't protect her own children. Thankfully, all of her children were males, because he didn't really have any barriers on who his victims were. it just all came down to age. And it was very well known in my family on all sides that the younger you were, the less you were allowed to be around Uncle Lloyd or Grandpa Lloyd or whatever you were to him. And he owned a pool company when he got out of the military, so he had free access to lots and lots of children. And I got sick of it. And I was around 7 or 8, and something happened at my aunt's house. And my aunt's house was here. My grandparents, my mother's parents were here, and Lloyd lived over here. And I marched out of my aunt's house and I marched into my grandparents' house, and I just word vomited something, whatever it was that happened at that moment. And my grandparents just said, "That's it. You're not allowed around him anymore." And I remember my cousins being sent over from my pot growing uncle's house to sit with me, and my mom's parents and my uncle went over there and beat the hell out of him, but not enough to stop him, just enough that he would taunt me. And all of the older kids knew that for whatever reason I was free of, at that point, like, nobody was allowed to fuck with me. And the older cousins were safe because they had aged out of his preference. And I think we all just kind of had this false sense of maybe it's not going to happen anymore, but it never stopped. And when I was a teenager, I didn't know that he was living at my aunt's house. And I walked in one day and I saw him, and he made a snarky comment, and I lost my shit. And that was just the downward spiral for me. And my uncle said that I wasn't allowed to talk to his father that way, and I wasn't allowed to talk to Indigenous people that way. And I wasn't Indigenous enough, and I'm white passing enough that I was no longer a part of that part of the family. And I went straight to the state and I told them what was going on, and they didn't believe me. So I've made it my personal mission since I got sober to not just take that all with a grain of salt. There were a lot of things I didn't care that I put into my body, and a lot of things I didn't care that I did. And I always had this idea in my head that there's certain things I'm just never going to do, but I'm going to disassociate and I'm going to numb myself. And at 15, I could wake up and slam vodka. I couldn't get my parents to get me to help outside of the church. And I wouldn't tell the church anything because I knew they didn't care. And it just made the drinking worse. So I got myself kicked out of public school. And I thought I was like, I'm just going to get myself kicked out of school because then I can go somewhere else. Maybe I could be sent away. And my parents tricked me. And I went into a Mormon-based religious school. And the teacher there was probably my saving grace at the time, and just said, because the way the state views Mormons, it's homeschool, and you only have to finish your state exams to get out of here. And in the Mormon culture, once you're done with high school, you need to be out and married pretty quickly. So that teacher just told me that no matter what my choices were, I could get out of the family home if I finished my education. And as soon as I graduated high school at 16, with barely 2 years of high school behind me, it was a wrap. I went downhill. I maintained a job and I maintained my education, and my parents kicked me out because I wouldn't follow the rules. And my aunt took me in for a little bit. My grandparents took me in for a little bit. At one point, I tried to get sober and I moved to Salt Lake, only to find out they were more judgmental. And then I went back to Oregon and it went worse. It went really bad after that. Around age 19, I took a really deep dive into drugs. And then I woke up one day when I was 20, right around 21, and I was just like, I'm done. I need help. And my family's never going to give me the help I need or the support. And I literally packed a duffel bag and moved to the Colorado Rockies and spent 3 solid years in therapy and sobriety. It was intense, really intense. And then after that, I thought that I could kind of come back into society for the first time as a sober person at 23. And I transferred. I was going to school in Boulder, Colorado, and I transferred to a college in Pennsylvania and thought that that was going to be this magic ticket into some form of normalcy, away from it all, where I never had to think about it again. And it was better, but it took a lot more years of therapy and a lot of practicing my sobriety.
Do you think that the church were aware of the type of person that he was and they were enabling that behavior?
I went to the bishop of his ward and I told them everything. And he was stripped of the priesthood. He wasn't allowed to serve the sacrament. He wasn't allowed to go to the temple. And then I was told after that that was all the punishment he deserved and that we were to never discuss it again.
So the Mormon church, in this case, feels as if they are judgment enough.
Yeah. That was the appropriate punishment, and we can't take it to the secular world because he would be unjustly punished.
And so when you move to Salt Lake and you're really struggling with all of these things that have happened and the lack of support that you've had from your family and from your congregation and from the people that lead that congregation, why is it surprising that you don't want to open up to them about your problems with drinking or anything else that you're going through? Why is it surprising to them, or why is it difficult for people to understand that you don't want to open up and be vulnerable when you're probably just going to be told that the correct course of action has already been taken and there's nothing else anybody can do?
Because victims are blamed. It's the victim's fault. We should not have been putting ourselves in those positions. We should have known that he had no self-control and that his lack of self-control was our fault. And if we knew that he was like that, then we shouldn't have been around him. And therefore, it's not his fault.
But you're young children. You can't always ensure that the environments that you're in are, even as adults, you can't do that. Even as adults, you can't make sure that the environments that you are in don't contain individuals that you don't want to associate with or be in close proximity with or don't want to spend time with. Even as an adult, that's not possible. And what's so difficult about this situation is that when you go to law enforcement and you finally tell the state about what is going on with this person, that you're not believed. And that must be because you don't have the supporting testimonies of other people that have experienced abuse. And so that must mean that you don't have your parents there to go with you to report this person to the state. And that in itself is so heartbreaking.
All the Mormon family members lied to the police. They said that I was a troubled kid, that I was making up things. It's not as bad as it really sounds. I was rebelling. I just wanted to have more freedom. I was just saying whatever I could to be removed from the situation.
I think if a child is going to be labeled as a troubled child, then the situation that you found yourself in probably warrants you to become a troubled child. You were troubled, you needed help, you needed support, you needed intervention, you needed protection, and you didn't get any of those things. So of course you're going to be troubled. You're troubled even if you don't act troubled, even if you're not acting out in a way that might suggest that you're troubled. You are a troubled child. It doesn't mean that you're causing trouble. And if you are causing trouble, it's a direct result of the things that you have experienced and the things that you have been made subject of. And it's so hard to think about all of the families that, for the sake of their religion or their faith or their image or the way that they are perceived by others, are not protecting their children in the way that children need to be protected. It's so hard to think about the amount of children in the world that exist that are not receiving the proper protection. Even just thinking about Indigenous children and how their citizenship might be different to those of typical Americans or typical people in other countries that may cast themselves as superpowers. And that comes down again to human trafficking and child trafficking and labor trafficking, and the situations where more vulnerable children may find themselves wrapped up in a system that exists to exploit them for one reason or another. And it's so hard to think about that, especially as two individuals on a planet of like 7 to 8 billion people. And then kind of, the existential dread sets in, like, what can we do to change this? But this conversation will make a difference. What one conversation at a time will bring awareness to these subject matters. And there may be somebody listening today that has experienced similar things that will know that they aren't alone and that their experiences are validated, even if they have been wiped away just as yours were. There could be somebody listening today that thinks, I experienced something similar and there was nobody there to advocate for me. There was nobody there to protect me or believe me or to make changes or to go to the police or law enforcement and to get these people named and arrested. So, I mean, you don't stay in this difficult period of time forever. You do manage, as you said, to become sober at some point. So what does that journey look like?
So my early 20s were tough. I think rightfully so, for so many different reasons. I'm homeless at 16, 17. I'm outcast from the majority of the family. I move somewhere and yeah, I moved from the West Coast to Salt Lake, Utah with my mom's best friend who was supposed to help me. And she just used my parents. She took thousands and thousands of dollars from them because she said that she needed help with paying the bills. Yet her son and I, who are the same age, were working full time. And she was working full time as a nurse. And we were giving her our paychecks and taking care of her two youngest. And I befriended one person when I lived there. And I'm still friends with them today. And she was just as fucked up because of her Mormon experience and all of her trauma. And trauma bonding is something that I didn't learn about until I was much, much older. But I had a really great manager at the store I worked at. I worked at a shoe store, and he was an immigrant from Zimbabwe, and he just would listen to things and he'd just say, that isn't right. That isn't normal. You don't have to do that. You don't have to take care of these children. She was supposed to let you become a different person. I was supposed to be there trying to work on myself and to save money and figure out what I needed. And instead, she was siphoning. She took every penny I could make. And then I have subsequently found out that she was taking money from my parents, who were supposed to be using that for my oldest sister's college to help her pay. And my parents felt obligated because she's Mormon and my mom's childhood best friend, and she wouldn't do them dirty. She wasn't trying to just take money, but she was. And she was going off and she was disappearing on us for days. And we were taking care of these two smaller children at 18, 19. And I just got sick of it one day and I blew up at her because she had gone through my room and like read my journals and then used them against me and called my parents and read them what was in my journals. So I packed up all my stuff and I'm leaving this house. And I marched next door to my only friend's house, and her grandparents let me move in, no questions asked. And I stayed there for a few months, and I felt so judged by the freaking community there, because here I was, some stranger from somewhere else that was living with this woman who turned out was grifting. Typical Mormons, just grifting. The Salt Lake Mormons are really trashy. And
taking pages straight out of Joseph Smith's Book of Mormon.
Yes, straight out of it. So it turned out that she was grifting all this money because she was involved in an MLM.
Okay.
It comes full circle. And she was barely scraping by because she was pumping all this money into an MLM that she thought was going to make her get rich quick. And when that information came out, my parents said that I could go back home because I had X amount of what they thought was sober time. And I wasn't. I was still drinking. I was drinking more in Utah than I was before. And when I went back for a little bit, I was actually really trying to work on myself. And my parents just doubted me every step of the way. So I was just like, screw it. You think I'm doing it? I'm just going to go do it. What does it matter? Nobody has my back. So I'm just going to have to take care of myself. And when I moved back from Salt Lake to Oregon, I was told that I could stay with my parents for a little bit. And that didn't end up happening. And that's okay. Like, honestly, how are they supposed to trust anything at that point with me when I had spent several years at this point doing whatever I wanted to do? And I wasn't necessarily like giving them a song and a dance, but I would just put it in their face. Like, yeah, I'm just going to go get fucked up. I don't care what you think. Who cares? Like, you never cared about me. I just gave it right back to them. I was very bitter, very cold, very calculated at that point, that I was just like, I'm going to hurt you the way you hurt me. And my I might be a little biased because I'm a daddy's girl, but it was never to my dad. It was always to my mom, because it was her sister, it was her family. They're the ones that converted to this religion, and she's the one who should have been protecting me.
Once you move back to your parents and things are strained, and then you're promised to go back to your parents' house, but that doesn't end up happening. Is there a point in your life where you realize that you want to make changes, that you want to take care of yourself? Is there somebody that comes into your life that helps you to make those changes? And what age does that happen? Because you're 18, 19 when you're having this particular experience.
So I moved back right after I turned 19. And until I was 21, it was really bad. I started dating a drug dealer. And pretty much just floating between his house and just hanging out wherever I wanted. And then for a while, I lived in a Volkswagen van again, because it was safe and I didn't trust a lot of people, and I had put myself in really crappy positions. And I still had friends from my hometown, and I had other friends that I had met along the way, but I was very, very guarded. I didn't open up to anyone at that point. Nobody really knew anything about me and about my life. And there was a really, really bad summer. It was the summer of 1999, and I was 20, almost turning 21. And at that point in time on the West Coast, there was a lot of gang activity and a lot of biker gangs in the area. And a bunch of my friends were killed or went to prison for very long stints. And what did it for me was, two of my friends were in a car in a high-speed car chase. And at one point, the driver pulled over and pushed my friend out the passenger seat and said, "I'm not taking you down with me." And the car chase ended up in a pretty gnarly accident. And my buddy was in the hospital for several months. And then he went to prison for 10 years. And that is when I was like, my life is not good. Shortly after he went to jail, one of our friends was running guns back and forth from Oregon to California, and he was too messed up on drugs and caused an accident with a semi, and it chopped the top of his car off and it severed his head off. And
Oh my goodness.
That's what did it.
Wow.
Not my own drug use, not my own crap position in life, not all the other things I had been through, but somebody's head being severed off is what made me just go, enough is enough. And I called my parents and I said, I was working 2 jobs at this point and was so deep in my addiction that I had gas money, I had drug money, but nothing else, absolutely nothing else to my name. And I said that, that's it, I'm done. And they're like, yeah, whatever, kid. And that same day, a really, really good friend of mine who had never been involved with the drugs and has always been a really solid human, called me at my parents' house and had found out about a lot of the death and destruction and said, I got a spot and a job for you, but you have to be sober. And I was like, all right, how long can you hold this? And he was like, a month tops. And that's just unheard of. Nobody can hold an open spot for you with a job and housing for a month. For whatever reason, it happened. And I slept for 2 weeks nonstop.
Wow.
And then I called my brothers, my little cousins, and I said, I want you to come spend the weekend with me, and then you're not going to see me for a while. And they didn't know why. And they spent the weekend with me up at my parents' house. And my mom and my aunt and the boys dropped me off at the bus station in downtown Portland. And it took 3 days on a bus to get to the Colorado Rockies, and I slept the whole time. And I got to Denver, and my buddy picked me up, and we drove 2.5 hours from Denver up into the Rocky Mountains. And that's where I finally figured it out. It wasn't easy by any stretch of the imagination. And I don't want anyone out there that listens to this to think that just because you finally make that choice to change your life around means that it's magic. Because it's not. But it's fucking worth it.
And it's worth it because of the life that you have now. So I didn't know if you could tell listeners a little bit about the family that you have now and sort of the position that you find yourself in that is significantly different
so much better
to the one that we've spoken about in
I promise there's a happy ending, guys. So after 3 years in the Rockies, I got my shit together and I applied for my undergrad in vet school. Through all this, I have a brain, I have intelligence, I have street smarts, and I have book smarts, thankfully. And that plays back to my parents making sure that education was driven. So I moved to Pennsylvania, and it's super tough to get in. East Coast was not. I wasn't ready for the East Coast. They're pretty tough cookies. They have tough skin. They have a very high educational drive, especially in the Northeast section. And they're really freaking smart. I felt very lost when I first moved out there. But I did it. I went to school, and my first year of my undergrad, unfortunately, I was working in a vet clinic as a vet tech, and it didn't go super well. And I ended up with a goofy thumb injury that took me out of vet school in the middle of getting my hand repaired, which included around 10 surgeries and the whole bunch of craziness going on with my hand. But
wait, hang on. Like my two top teeth aren't straight. I would call that goofy, like perhaps goofy looking. And I could get braces to fix that and get my teeth straightened. 10 surgeries on a goofy thumb injury doesn't make sense. So there's something not quite right.
I don't know how well you can see it through the camera. Do you see the scars on my thumb?
Yeah, I see.
And that's all the thumb movement I have. So normally you have an opposable thumb. So I have.
Wow, okay. Right.
So
okay.
I had a cat kind of latch onto me and basically create a big injury. It was a big scratch from here to here. And unfortunately, the ER gave me a referral to a hand surgeon that wasn't a hand surgeon. He ended up being a plastic surgeon and not very good at it. And it was all on workers' comp. And I'm sure a lot of people know how crappy the American healthcare system is. And I was young and newly sober. So I just was like, okay, I'm just going to do what you tell me to do. And, I'm going to try really hard to maintain, I'm staying in school, and that's that. So, unfortunately, it was just a really crappy situation where a little injury, had it been repaired correctly, could have been fine. Unfortunately, I had a black and green necrotic wound that ended up with an MP and CMC joint fusion, and I had to have a lot of surgeries to fix it and a lot of physical therapy.
Wow. All from a cat.
All from a cat.
Wow. Not even like a big cat either, just like a domestic house cat.
Just a domestic cat.
Wow, that's wild.
I got cat scratch fever, and I just had a really hard time fighting off the infection.
Wow.
And in the middle of all that, I ended up pregnant.
Oh, wow.
So here I am in Pennsylvania. Still kind of newly doing the sobriety thing compared to, all the stuff I had been through and gone through. 25. Baby daddy and I are 11 years apart. We're not together anymore. No daddy issues here, huh? And in the midst of navigating my hand injury and finishing school and having a baby and not being with that person for very long, I still accomplished a lot of new dreams and goals. So I have my master's in physical therapy.
Oh, wow.
I hated it, but I finished.
Oh.
I hated it. I tried. I really tried to enjoy it, but it was really tough. I had this idea in my head after my own experience with my hand issue that I was actually going to be helping people get mobility, keep mobility, learn how to navigate the body. And it wasn't so much just, it didn't turn out to be 100% you're helping people through things. It was projection of my own experience where I had the most amazing physical therapist through my whole injury and recovery. So I met my husband the first year I moved to Pennsylvania, and we were just friends. And we didn't really even like each other at first. It was just a mutual friend and
acquaintances.
And he was very aware of the fact that I was with baby daddy for a couple years, and when I became single, he definitely wasn't going to pass up the opportunity, and so we've been together ever since. And he's put up with all my craziness.
When you say we didn't really even like each other, that must have been you, because as soon as there was an opportunity, he was like, hey, let's go out on a date.
Well, let's ask him. Hey, Mike, come here. When we first met, and I thought you were a pretentious rich boy living at your parents' house, what was your first thoughts of me? Can you hear him?
No, not really.
Come here.
What did he say? Hi, Mike.
Oh,
great to meet you.
Yeah, so when she showed up with our a mutual friend at the time,
you have to get in the camera.
Me and that friend weren't on such great terms. And I was just like, oh, so here's this freeloader and another freeloader.
That's so funny, because do you know what this reminds me of? It reminds me of is it your mother and father?
Yeah.
Like two different very polar opposite people who just found so much in common and just really have such a strong connection to one another. And despite all of the perhaps shortcomings of your parents in terms of protecting you as a child, they were a partnership. They supported each other to carry on with their own educations and had a regimented routine at home, which meant that both of them could continue on things that they wanted to do. And it sounds as if you and your partner have been very much the same in supporting each other, even though your first impressions of one another made you feel like chalk and cheese.
So we had been dating for a few years, and I told him, like, I couldn't keep living as a single mom, working multiple part-time jobs, finishing my education. And I was like, listen, yo, my lease is almost up on my apartment. I might have to move in with my parents in Florida. And he was just like, no. And I'm like, what do you mean no? Like, I'm a grown ass hot mess. I don't have choices. I have to finish my education. And then that's when he was like, you guys want to move in here?
Oh.
Now, at that point, we had kept my child and my time with Mike very separate. When I had my baby, I had my baby. I wasn't getting a babysitter and hanging out with him. I wasn't skipping out on my parenting time and my educational time to date. And he was 100% like, yeah. And I was like, as long as you understand, like, every other weekend I'm free type of thing, then like, cool. But when he was like, no, you guys can move in here, I'm like, homie, do you know how messed up I am? Like, obviously at this point, I was much more put together, and
Mike's everything isn't like roses and like as easy as.
No, but I am very dubious of people that suggest that they are.
Like, we're both very strong-willed people who made choices in our lives to not be very conventional. He's an only child. My dad's an only child. My child's an only child. So I was just like, oh, these only children, that's tough. But we have a lot of commonalities throughout our vastly different lives, where he chose to make sure that he had an education for himself in a way he wanted, not the way his parents expected. And when I met him, he was currently living at his parents' home for a very short time, because shortly before I moved to Pennsylvania, he was involved in a car accident that was life-changing. So he was living there while dealing with recovering from some major, major body traumas. He had to have a major surgery on his shoulder and knee, and he had been in an induced coma for a little while. And so when I met him, I was just like, ugh, you're just pretentious. And he meets me and he's like, ugh, you're hanging out with a freeloader. You have to be a freeloader. But we were starting to become mutuals in the same social circle. And it was not an instant click by any stretch of the imagination. But throughout time and getting to know each other, then we found out that we really did have a lot of similarities. And one of the things that still to this day really helps with our relationship, I think, is we're both very stubborn. And that's not a good thing.
I was going to say, you said something that really helps our relationship is that we're both very stubborn. And I was like, are you sure that that's helpful?
It is, surprisingly, and not always in positive ways. It can be a little bit, we're both thick-headed and
I think that
determined.
That means that you probably challenge each other on your opinions and your ideas and what you think is right and wrong. And I think it's important to have people in your life that certainly do those things.
Yes, and not giving up. Like, we knew when we got together that, like, it was heavily discussed because we were bringing a small human into the equation. And people laughed at us at first because we had a rental agreement to move into the home he owned.
Wow. Well,
to like, you will not be in a position where, like, I'm not going to screw you on helping with bills or expecting you to take care of my child for me. And you're not going to leave me high and dry on the streets with nowhere to live if we don't make it. It was very pragmatic. And the first, I would say 6-7 years were just a breeze, very, very thankfully. And then when we decided to get married,
I bet the wedding invitation list was an interesting conversation.
It was very, very small, but I was in a really nasty car accident less than a month before we got married. Oh my goodness,
so no! What is going on?
I don't remember any of it.
What?
Yeah.
How is this possible? Your friend with the fatal car accident, and then your partner with his car accident, and now you're in a car accident. What is going on?
So many things could have gone so differently, but through that, even more craziness happened. Shortly after we got married, and I started becoming more functional, and it took, I don't really have a good memory of like about a 4-year time period, but
oh my goodness.
Shortly after getting married and having some really negative things happen at the company I was working for, it took my child to go see Uncle Nick for their birthday. And I looked at my brother and I was like, screw them, I'm going to quit my job. And he's like, shut up. No, you're not. So when we got home from a weekend in Boston, I just did my biggest punk rock FU, quitting a company that I've ever had in my life. And it was glorious. And I screwed them royally. I don't recommend this for anyone listening. Please don't do that to your employers. My situation was one where they had used and abused me. And when they ruined my child's birthday weekend, I was done. And I started my own company. And I was very successful. And it was a huge sacrifice at the same time. I would work 18-hour days, physical labor. I was cycling all over the city, walking dogs, taking care of exotic animals, and helping develop a doggy daycare. And once the pandemic hit and Philadelphia, we had the riots, which were super annoying. I think more so than just having just the pandemics and the civil unrest and all the death that America had experienced in 2020. America became a war zone, and specifically Philadelphia. We lived in the Kensington section, and it was the U.S.'s largest open-air drug market. So we not only had to deal with fentanyl in our faces everywhere, but people ODing, and a pandemic, and an extreme change in gentrification in our neighborhood, where some of the houses went from, $50,000-$60,000 in value to $500,000 for a rundown row home. So you have me coming out of a head injury and my company going like this and the world going like this. And
when you say protests, do you mean the protests because of what happened with George Floyd
and Kanisha, which, oh my gosh, that woman's name is escaping my head right now. The woman that was shot dead in her apartment because they did a no-knock warrant.
Yeah, so this is all happening
in 2020.
In 2020. I was going to say in the last 2 years. Wow, that's wild.
Then my husband, who worked 21 solid years, never effed off with his work, was a boss for the same company for 20 years. They closed and they screwed him out of a transfer.
They just shut down. Oh my goodness, what is happening?
So you have all of these crazy things going on in the world, and
oh my gosh, hang on, wait, do you win at some point?
Yeah.
My
Are you kidding me? I'm sober. I'm winning.
I mean that's probably not a correct judgment, because
that's fine.
You are sober, you have your child, you're in a loving relationship with your partner, but all of these things that are happening, all of these events feel like they are against you and your growth and your
but I have somebody in my life who has my back no matter what, and that's what I never had.
Somebody sent me a quote yesterday, a very good friend of mine. I asked her if she'd managed to sort some problem that she'd had in her life. And it's a problem that some people may have, but others may never experience. Like if you grow up and you are struggling to get money together to pay for your driving lessons, but you've got a housemate whose parents just pay for her to learn how to drive, that kind of situation. So it's a situation that she's struggling with that not everybody may struggle with. And I said to her, did you get it sorted? And she said, no, I'm just a loser. And I said, what do you mean you're just a loser? She said, in life, there are some winners where everything comes to them so easily. They never have to worry about where their next meal comes from, the roof over their head, or how they're going to accomplish their next goals. They just win. And then there are people like me who are losers, who have to work so fucking hard for everything that they have in life. That makes the winners feel like they have it even easier. So it feels like in this situation, you're not a loser in the sense of the word that people might associate immediately when you say you're a loser. But what I mean is everything feels like it's so against you. You're having all of these things happen in such a short period of time. This car accident.
You have to remember that it was ingrained into me to be happy.
Yeah, and that
it
God's
was ingrained in me
you.
to just keep going. It was ingrained into me that all of these things happen for a reason. So some of those indoctrinating things don't leave. Even at 42, when I've been away from my family since I was 16, 17. There's some things that I just won't allow myself to let go of. And if I just roll over and let life win, I'm not going to get anything.
And is Mike aware of your entire family history? He knows the ins and outs of absolutely everything.
So we spent several years just taking everything as in the moment. Like we knew each other had stuff and things, but it wasn't important. I didn't need to. It was really important to me to not rehash every shitty thing in life. And he was in the same boat, you know? I'm going to call him out a little bit on this and he'll get annoyed and forgive me. His parents worked really, really hard for everything they ever had.
Yeah.
They both went to college. I want to say my mother-in-law's family was probably able to support her educational needs more than my father-in-law's, which my father-in-law had to put himself into the army so that he could afford to go to school, and he did it.
Okay.
And then they built they were very comfortable.
Okay.
My husband grew up going to prep school. So his education is not lacking. You know, where I went to public school.
Your husband is a winner.
Yes. But his parents did not just hand him anything on a silver platter.
Right.
They had very firm expectations that everything from his very first car he had to buy from them.
Yes, and it's so hard to find that balance between providing a stable and exciting and educational and all of all of the buzzwords, life for your young ones, but also making sure that they grow up responsible and understanding money and building on life skills like cooking and cleaning without making them feel like all they do is tend to the housework. It's an impossible thing. It's an impossible thing. And that's why people make so much money selling books about how to do it properly.
So, I think the part of the reason that we worked so well is we didn't have this overwhelming urge to know every dirty detail about each other, because our pasts obviously morph us into who we are today, but it wasn't important to either one of us. We didn't care about what all those little traumas in life before were. It was more important for both of us that the people we were in that moment and that time was a good human. And we'd both been burned by people closest to us, and our families. The old saying, blood is thicker than water, doesn't exist. And we just really enjoy each other and each other's company.
And so great. I love that.
So we did break up after a few years. We had to, because it was a necessity. We both needed to get through, we just had a little bit of piss and vinegar left to get out of us. And when we started hanging out again after that, we kept it very quiet, very, very quiet. Only maybe 2 people on each side of our friendship circle knew. And it was amazing, absolutely amazing, because we didn't want everybody around. We didn't need all the socialization and
you've grown up in an environment where everything is very, very public forum for people to see, to judge on, to comment on. So it's understandable that you enjoyed kind of just not having to share that information with anybody, not feeling pressured for everybody to know the ins and outs of your everyday life.
Yeah. And we've kind of carried that throughout the rest of our relationship to this day. When we decided that we were getting married, 5 months later, we were married, and it was very quiet. It was very, a very inner circle, even with our family. In fact, only his parents from his family were invited.
Wow.
Let alone
would a traditional Mormon ceremony be on a slightly larger scale?
So if you're a good Mormon, you get married in the temple, and it's just you and your spouse.
Right.
And it's very secretive. And you don't even get to wear your wedding dress. You are hushed into the temple and removed and taken into separate quarters and stripped and put into these awful costumes. And then you have to do these secret handshakes. And then you're given a new name. And then you leave the temple and you go and you have a big meal with your friends and family. And quite often between the temple and the meal, you sneak off for your first sexual experience.
Tryst. It's kind of reminding me now of Laurie Vallow and Chad Daybell, who I've covered a lot on the very, very early episodes of the podcast, where they managed to sneak off to the temple and get married after Chad Daybell's wife had passed away. And there's a lot of people asking now how that was even possible, because one of them needed to convert, or because it happened over in Hawaii, and the details are quite blurry. And of course, the case to this day is still moving through the court system, which is why I haven't done an update episode. But even the word temple makes it sound like it's more sacred or elusive or enticing than perhaps other ceremonies or buildings you might want to be encouraged to visit or invited into. But But just to summarize now, because we're getting towards the end of the episode, there's a lot of things mixed in with your belief system around the level of commitment to the Mormon Church from one side of your family and the lack of devotion to the church from the other side of your family. So it's almost like you grew up with this 50-50 yin and yang sort of here and there black and white approach to things around the Mormon Church. And you wanted so much through your strong personality to explore your independence and your individualism, which was just quashed all the time. So you would try to go over to your grandparents. You would put yourself in positions that may have landed you in danger, or may have put you in questionable situations that involve police raids and your uncle growing illegal substances and whatever else. I mean, it's probably not illegal in that state now, but at the time most definitely was. Yes. But the restriction from access to that information and from that secular world fed into your curiosity, into that need for your independence, into that need for your individualism. And so after you experience these really horrific things around sexual abuse that you try to speak out about in your outspoken manner, in your confident manner, you're one of the only people to come forward and say, this is happening. And although that gets this perpetrator stripped of their position within the church, although it might result in family members saying, okay, now he won't come near you, which he shouldn't have been doing in the first place, because people should have gone to the police years before. But that's a discussion for somebody that's probably allowed to be more opinionated than I am on their own platforms. But you then have this very, very difficult period of almost descending into, now I will have my own independence and my own individualism on a scale that could never have been preconceived. So you kind of jump off the deep end and decide that you are going to try drinking, which escalates into substance abuse, which escalates into you trying to work jobs to make sure that you can maintain that kind of addiction around substances. But then you fall pregnant and you maintain your sobriety through your pregnancy and through the birth of your child. You meet an acquaintance who you think is pretentious and you're like, oh my goodness, this guy who's just, not my type at all. And then you marry him through difficult circumstances. You kind of withstand all of the difficulties that life throws at you, and you're still together to this day. So I mean, that journey in itself, have you considered like writing about it at all? Because surely that's something that's crossed your mind.
I mean, yes, I want to use my experience to help others. Writing for me was very cathartic. And then having my mom's best friend use that against me has made it more personal.
I see that. Mm-hmm.
But it won't stop me. I just need to find a way. And I think that's probably why I reached out to you.
Mm-hmm.
There's a way to get my voice and my story out there. I just don't know how to start it.
Well, this is the start. This is hopefully writing is something, if you're passionate about it, you can pick up at some point and bring kind of into your life and adopt. And maybe just a way to start would be to just write a chronological this and then this and then this and then this, So I was born, and then this happened, and then this, a little bit like what we've done today. And, just write the experiences that go in between. And it could be a blog, and it could be something that you read aloud and have your own podcast, or something that you do spoken word of, or poetry or stories or anything. I'm such a huge advocate for art and the healing properties of artistry, and how it can help people to recover from things, to explore things. So I really think that people may benefit from your story, not just from a high demand religious background, but also from a background of familial sexual abuse, through substance abuse and sobriety and recovery, through growing up, having a child who you then separate from the father of the child, and learning to adapt to life as a single parent. There's so many different themes within your story that I think could really be approachable and really validating for other people to hear. And I am so thankful that you have come forward today, and you've been so open with us, and you've really allowed us to listen to your experiences, even though some of the subject matter has been extremely difficult for us to get through today. You have a master's degree. You have recovered from years of horrific abuse that some people may never recover from. You have a beautiful family that you have harnessed your time and energy into making sure that your child feels safe and loved. And even just talking about how you kept your relationship separate from your child is just so different to what you spoke about experiencing as a young person. So even though there were difficulties in your life, you definitely took things that you struggled with from your childhood and said to yourself, I'm not going to allow my child to experience the same things. And that's so obvious in what you've spoken about today. I think your testimony has been so strong in so many different ways. It speaks to how people in positions of power are allowed to get away with things that they shouldn't be allowed to get away with, and how there needs to be legal and spiritual and religious change around these things. You've spoken about how your parents were quite liberal around your education, and how you were lucky for that. So some of the stance that you've positioned yourself on today, or some of the ways that you've positioned yourself today in the Mormon faith, is actually quite fair. And you haven't even spoken about specific doctrines that make your experience so unique from other religions. Your story, if we would have beeped the word Mormon or LDS or Mormonism out, could apply to so many other people that are in any other high demand religious group. And that is terrifying, but I think is also, as I've said before, so validating. So thank you so much, Megan, for coming here today. Thank you for being raw and vulnerable with us, and for just giving us your testimony and allowing us to hear your experiences through speaking about them and being honest. And I know it's been difficult. I think both of us have been a bit teary. So it's just, I know it's not easy to relive these things. You probably will go away and think about a million things that we didn't discuss. We didn't talk about the LGBTQIA community. We didn't talk about
I feel like we could do so much more.
Yes, we didn't talk about Brad Wilcox, the leader of the Provo Utah group, who said something extremely racist on February the 6th. There's so many things that we didn't speak about, but I think that's okay, because sometimes we may have episodes where we talk about the history, principles, practices, doctrine, belief systems of a group. And we may have some episodes where that stuff doesn't matter, but the personal experiences that we discuss do matter. And that's the kind of conversation that we've had today. And I think that's so wonderful. So thank you so much for your time, Megan.
Well, thank you. And thank you for listening. And I feel like it's so imperative, the work you're doing and the way you're doing it, and allowing people to, I had no intentions on coming in here and being sappy, but it's fine. Like, and that's the message that I think I want other people to be aware of, is it is okay to experience this bullshit and this trauma and still be okay. Like, my life isn't perfect. I fought really hard my whole life to be me. And, you know, some of my closest friends, we joke, especially in the punk rock community, bruised student tattooed. You can look at my tattoos and have zero idea that I've been through any of this. I make sure that I lead with the way I want people to treat me. And I want other people to be accepted. And everybody's story is important.
I love that.
And at the end of the day, I think it goes back to before my mother-in-law passed, I asked her to write me down one statement to tattoo on me that she wanted us to remember. And that's know that you're loved, know that you're well loved. And I have that on my forearm. So I read it a lot and I get teary-eyed a lot, because at the end of the day, she created my husband and he's my rock. And through all of this, and we've been through some shit.
I love that.
But you can still get through it. And
you
have a voice.
And you're a living, breathing example of somebody who can go through so much trauma at a young age and then hit rock bottom in your early teens and young adulthood, and then claw your way back to further education, to starting your own business. And you know, we talk about marriage and owning a house and starting a family as some of the more conventional earmarks of adulthood, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. You are sober. What a huge accomplishment that is. Dude. You know, it doesn't have to be that, oh, you started a family, you have a nuclear family, now you know you're really living up to the conventional standards of adulthood. It doesn't have to be that. It doesn't have to be that. It can be that you go through one day and you don't get absolutely terrified that the ground is going to open up and swallow you whole and you're going to be stuck in hell for the rest of your life. It doesn't have to be that you watch some secular television and spend the rest of your day feeling terrified. It might be that you sit down and you watch an episode of Doctor Who and you're like, do you know what? I just thoroughly enjoyed that. And that's the only feeling that I have. You know, it could be that you go and speak to your therapist. It could be that you go for a walk with a friend. It could be any number of things. It doesn't have to be the conventional things that people identify with, air quotes, successful adulthood. It doesn't have to be those things at all, because just getting out of bed and having a shower on some days is such a huge accomplishment for some people. So let Megan be a living, breathing example of how you can go through so much trauma, spiritual trauma, sexual abuse, emotional, physical abuse, police raids and substance abuse and also all manner of wild things, and still be sitting here today talking to me in her 40s as somebody who is sober and has a family and is just taken every day as it comes and has, you know, a really confident way about her and is coming forward to share that story with other people. I just think that's incredible, Megan. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I'm going to say goodbye, but I know it's still early where you are. So please enjoy the rest of your day and say a massive thank you to Mike from me for all that he has done to support you.
Thank you. I will. And go take care of those littles.
I will. Thank you, Megan. I'll speak to you soon. Take care.
Right.
Bye.
Bye.
That is the end of this week's episode. If you'd like to get in touch, please email me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram @cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, and this has been the Cult Vault.